There we go. Okay, it's so nice to see everyone. I have a lot of papers here because I was planning on sharing the screen. I can't figure out 100% how to do that from here, but we'll get all of the technology in place. So we're going to talk today about Tisha Bav. Your prediction was prescient, and talk a little bit about specifically the question about eating on Tisha Bav. Now you say, 1 second, Tisha B'Av is the day we don't eat. But that's actually what I want to get a little bit about the meaning and the idea of Tisha B'Av, based on the question of the following practical issue. We'll start with the practical issue and then we'll get it, which is to the extent that somebody does eat on Tisha B'Av, right? For a health reason, you're required to eat on Tisha B'Av. So do you make the regular blessings, right? Do you make a bracha? Do you do Birkat Hamazon? Do you make a bracha after you finish eating? Assuming you do that, are there any additions to the text that you say because it's Tisha B'Av? So, for example, on Shabbat, when you do the grace after meals, you do the Birkat Hamazon, you add a special paragraph for Shabbat. Do you add that paragraph, or do you add some sort of paragraph because of Tisha B'Av? Now, what paragraph would you add? So we add a paragraph in the shul davening, in the tefillah, in the Amidah, called Nachem. Nachem is a prayer that we add. See, we got a.
I'm doubling the.
Yeah, no, we have a whole crew here on the computer as well. So the tefillah of Nachem, which is a prayer that's said on Tisha B'Av in the Amidah, in the Siddur, in the shul, do we add that to the Birkat Hamazon, to the benching on Tisha B'Av? So let's just lay out the question before we start analyzing the issue and where it comes from. Think about it this way. On one hand, every time you do a prayer, you always add the unique thing about that day. So if you're going to pray on holiday, on Yom Tov, you're going to say something special about that Yom Tov. If you're going to pray on Shabbat, you're going to say something special about Shabbat. So should you also say the prayer that is special about Tisha B'Av? That's one hand. Listen, it's a prayer. You should say, like we say, B'nai Yerushalayim, God should rebuild Jerusalem. You should say Nachem. You should give it's a prayer asking for consolation that we mourn for Jerusalem. On the other hand, you could say that this is the ultimate and ridiculous irony, which is a day that you're not supposed to be eating. Why would you be in your mentioning the fast day in your prayer about the food you ate, right? It seems like it's somewhat of a sort of a strange irony that you would make a mention of today as Tisha B'Av in your prayer about food, right? You shouldn't eat, okay, nobody's arguing you have to eat for health reasons, but you're going to have to rub it in the face, so to speak, that you're going to mention that today is Tisha B'Av. That seems like it would be a sort of a strange irony. So that's the issue that I wanted to discuss, and we'll get to some philosophical points because of that issue. But it's a practical question that's actually raised, not regarding Tisha B'Av. Oh, it's okay. It's all good. No, it's all good. It's all good. We're all here together. That's great. No, it's okay. So this is actually raised about Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, there are two opinions. We'll see them in a moment. But on Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur is a holiday, right? You dress in your nicest clothing, right? You don't wear leather shoes, but you dress in your nicest clothing. You come to shul and you spend time in davening. So let's say, again, someone is ill and needs to eat on Yom Kippur. Do they say the Ya'alev Yavo tefillah in benching? Should they say that special tefillah in benching? And fascinating, maybe let's take this a step further. Should they say Kiddush? Should you make Kiddush on Yom Kippur? Should you have two challahs on Yom Kippur? Because, again, it's a day that is a Yom Tov. The only reason we don't say Kiddush is Kiddush usually requires drinking and it's a fast day. But if because of health reasons you're not fasting, should you actually infuse, bring in all the elements of the day that is Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or the holiday, etc. So there was a movie not long ago called Shrek. If you're familiar with the movie Shrek, it was a kid's movie. But one of the images from that movie is the onion. I don't know why that sticks in my head, but the image of the onion is something that has a core and then layers upon layers on top of it. And so this is one of the ways that this is addressed, which is that you have Yom Kippur, which is on one hand, it's a fast day. On the other hand, it's also a holiday. It's both of those contradictory things at the same time. So if because of health reasons, you peel away the most external layer, which is the fast day, what are you left with? A holiday. And on holidays, you make Kiddush. So that's actually the issue that's raised and is potentially, so to speak, exportable to Tisha Bav. So the Rabbeinu Asher, one of the great sages of early Ashkenazic Jewish law, says the following. He says that if you're an ill person, and this is, again, if I were sharing screen, it would be right here. A ill person who needs to eat on Yom Kippur and is able to get to a state that he is able to have his mind with him and able to do Birkat Hamazon, do benching. So the Torah says that the son of the Rosh, the Baal HaTurim, writes, my father told me that you were supposed to mention Yom Kippur in Birkat Hamazon. Meaning you're supposed to say, Ya'alev Yavo, you're supposed to say the special prayer for Yom Kippur when Ya'alev Yavo, B'bonei Yerushalayim. Yeah.
Okay, from my experience, my father actually went through this, but because it was Yom Kippur, he was only allowed to drink 1 ounce of water every hour.
Right. Yeah.
So that would not require.
That's correct. That's correct.
So if you are going to eat, it's usually so limited.
That's absolutely correct. That's a very good book. That term is called, your point is called shi'urim. Shi'urim means that you eat less than, shi'ur means the amount that is considered eating. So in your father's case, what actually happened is that he didn't actually break his fast because he ingested so little that from the legal technical standpoint, he didn't actually eat. In which case, you're right, this entire issue would be moot. The Talmud talks about a situation where there's a diagnosis that the person is so ill that they actually have to eat a regular meal. And that's the only technical situation where this actually would apply. Your point is, if the person is able to be kept safe from a health standpoint by eating pachot mikishur, which means less than the technically required amount, then indeed you are considered keeping your fast, and you would not even have this issue of making the additional and mentioned Birkat Hamazon. The other thing is you probably wouldn't eat bread per se. Yeah. Okay. So there is, as we like to say, not just the legal law, but a history to this particular law. I mentioned that it was Rabbeinu Asher of Yechibed ben Yechiel, who was the author of this law, who says you do make the Ya'alev Yavo, you do make a special mention when you're eating, even on a fast day. So where does this originally come from? So this halacha is sourced in Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, Maharam Rutenberg. Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, born in 1215 in Worms, in Germany. And in 1293, he ran afoul of King Rudolph, the German king. What was the issue upon which he ran afoul? He was a noted Jewish leader, a scholar, and a rabbi, community teacher, world renowned. He was, if you wanted a shaila, so to speak, anywhere in the world, especially in the Ashkenazic world, it was going to him. It was going to a mayor of Rottenburg. He decided to. There were, forces against him that went to the king and said that he was having seditious intent, and he wanted to bring the Jewish people to not be patriotic Germans in the German Empire. Now, just interestingly, back then there was no such thing as countries, right? A country, what we have it now, like the entire United States, when you can't travel, you can't communicate, it's basically impossible to administer, right? To actually be the administrator of a country, to have a federal government is, in the 1200s, where it would take 3 days to even get from the capital city to any of your place, is very, very difficult. So local government had much, much, much greater power. And it was really all the things that we think about as countries were an amalgam of individual fiefdoms. It was the pirates, or the governor, the local king of this tiny little place. By the way, if you think about it, if you look in Tanakh, you had kings of cities. The reason why you had kings of cities, right? The king of Gath, the king of Ashdod, you would often have kings of cities because that was the largest area you could truly have control over. To be the king of a country, that was a big deal, because there was this loose loyalty of the local, baron, or, but it was very hard to truly have control over an entire country. You needed the loyalty. But there was the king of Germany, King Rudolph, and he was definitely the king of, if not what we know of Germany as a country today, a very large area, very, very powerful king. And he had them, so Rabbi Mayor of Rottenburg decided to leave. And he was stopped at the border. On his way out, and he was taken to the Ansheim prison. And that was a high tower, in which he was imprisoned. And here was he was one of the authors of the Tosfot, which is one of the main commentaries on the Talmud, on the Gemara. And as he was leaving, he was caught, brought back to prison for a very, very simple thing: money. Kings were actually, since they didn't have a central bank, they didn't have central currency, kings were very much in need of money just to run the operations that they had. And so they would tax very heavily. And every once in a while, especially the Jews presented a ripe opportunity, because they had a very cohesive community, for ransom. So they brought Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg to the Ansheim prison, and he was imprisoned starting here in 1293. Right, so he was already an established leader. He was born in 1215. He refused to allow the community to ransom him. Refused to allow them to ransom him, and he died there. He died because he said, the minute you ransom me, that opens the floodgates. It's a long time debate among moral philosophers and countries, etc. Do you give in to ransom demands, and then you encourage the rest? Do not give in. So he was adamant not to give in to the ransom demands of and the Jewish community would have raised it in an instant. Whatever the money was, they would have raised it to free him. But he did not allow it to occur.
But didn't they pay to get his body out?
After he died, it took 15 years, but they were able to. They did do a ransom to get his body for burial. But interesting thing that he did was he made arrangements that they would, or the community made arrangements, that they had friendly guards that understood the predicament he was in. And so the guards allowed him, I mean, it was almost like a personal prison, meaning he was in this cell in this tower, but they allowed him unprecedented communication. People could write him letters, he could write letters back, and he became one of the chief architects of what I call Shat Hadchak Psak, which means rulings about halachic issues in situations which are less than ideal. So, which are not ideal situations, he created. So he is one of the great sources, and it became because of his own personal situation. So a shaila like, what do you do on Yom Kippur when, for health reasons, you can't fast? And in his later days, he was in failing health, and he was stuck in a prison. Nothing he could do. So he, now, what's unclear if he had access to his library. There are some who say that he was able to access libraries or have people bring him books so he could look up sources. Others say that he needed to do everything by heart. No computer, no internet, no emails. He was needed, but he was still considered the main halachic authority of all of Ashkenazic Jewry, and people sent him letters, and he would write letters back. And this was one of the key questions that he dealt with, which is everybody thinks Yom Kippur, you're going to shul and you're wearing your nice clothing and you're coming early and you have a beautiful meal ready for you at home when you finish and you have a nice meal on Erev Yom Tov. You have all that stuff. So Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg was the one who started opening people's eyes. But things aren't always that simple. What happens if your meal is waiting for you in a prison cell, which is where he was and spent the last years of his life. So he felt philosophically and halachically that you should incorporate the day when you bench. You should have benching, and you should say Ya'alev Yavo. And the idea is, again, like the onion, once you peel away the fast day of Yom Kippur, you're left with a Yom Tov. And if you take it a step further, Hagos Maimonides, which is one of the contemporaries that ended up learning from him, says that if you have the need to eat on Yom Kippur, you should have 2 challahs, you should have kiddush, you should have all the things you would have on a Yom Tov for exactly this reason, which is it's an onion. You peel away. Yom Kippur is 2 days merged into one. There's the fast day, and that overlays the Yom Tov. So you only do Yom Tov kind of things, like going to shul, like wearing nice clothing, that don't interfere with the fast. When the fast day is pulled away, it sort of uncovers the Yom Tov aspect of Yom Kippur. And if that's the case, he said you should treat Yom Kippur like a full-on and complete and total Yom Tov. That's what the Rosh says in the name of the Marami Rutenberg, etc. Now, in that same period, Rome actually was a very different climate. And in 1270, there's a book called, I think it was actually written in early 1300s. But there was a book by someone by the name of Rabbi Tzedkiah ben Avraham HaRofeh. Rabbi Tzedkiah ben Avraham HaRofeh is just an interesting thing. His father was a physician. His father was a doctor, ben Avraham HaRofeh. There were very few places in the world where Jews could be doctors. The anti-Semitism in many places was so pronounced that there were guilds, and the guilds were locked to, had to be a part of a guild to be part of a particular profession. You had to be part of the blacksmith's guild or this, the shoemaker's guild. whatever it was, and Jews were barred from most of the kills. So in most of European, European Jewish communities, the Jews were very limited in what professions they could go in. One of the most common one was money lending, which they were not barred from because you only need to do money lending is have money, but it didn't make them very popular because they lent on interest and they were not particularly popular in that way. Okay, but the Shibboleth, but in Rome, in Italy, in many places, they had many more rights. So his father was a physician. His father was a doctor. And his Rabbi was Rabbi Avigdor Tzedek, who was also Italian. And he has a different approach. He says the following. He says, Choleh she'achal b'yom kippurim, an ill person, a sick person, who eats on Yom Kippur, does the person need to say to say special prayers for Yom Kippur? And my Rabbi Avigdor Kohen Tzedek, wrote me the following. Clearly, I do in a handwritten letter. Says, what's causing you to eat? What's causing you to eat is not Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur actually tells you not to eat. What's causing you to eat is the mitzvah the Torah says to make sure your health is safe. That's what's causing you to eat on Yom Kippur. So he therefore says that mishavi le kechol. So it's not an onion that's peeled away the fast and you're left with the Yom Tov. Fasting is such an inherent part of the day that when you take away the fasting, the whole day kind of falls apart. It's like a house of cards. You pull away one card, the whole thing falls. And therefore he says, it's like it's a weekday for you. So there, of course, there's did we make Kiddush this morning on a Thursday morning? Of course not. A Yom Kippur without fasting, according to the Shibboleth, which you generally, by the way, do not follow, he says it's like a weekday. And since it's like a weekday, Mistaver lo tikkun le'Rabbanan Azkara, you shouldn't mention Yom Kippur. And he adds that second point of like, it's the irony of it, that you should be mentioning Yom Kippur. I would say hide the fact that today is Yom Kippur when you bench, because you don't want to highlight the fact that this day of fasting, you're actually not fasting. So that's the approach of the Shibboleth.
If you don't eat bread, if you don't eat bread, I mean, there are people who need to eat something and
Right.
leave the minimum, aside from what my father did.
Mm-hmm.
But they will eat the minimum. They're not going to have a sandwich or bread, or they're going to eat just whatever.
Usually like a protein bar, they'll have a little extra nutrients.
Something
Yeah.
like that, or sugar pills.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's not, you don't bench for that. And what about nursing mothers? And I have a friend whose daughter just donated a kidney just yesterday.
Wow.
And I don't know that she's,
No, you don't fast. You don't fast. Yeah.
Tisha Bav.
Yeah. No, you don't fast. And there are rules for each of those. Generally, the basic idea is that if you're able to have safely less than a shiur, that's the way to do it. Pachot shiur, obviously. But you should know that we err on the side of caution. Meaning, if we think that you are in a situation that we may be in a more precarious health situation if you just eat a little bit, we say don't start that way. Actually eat what you need to eat, just to make sure that you're in good. And the example that's used is the example of a pregnant woman, where we don't want to play games with
nursing
mothers. Exactly, nursing mothers, exactly, for 2 years is usually the line. So that's
46 years count.
Yeah, 46 years of nursing.
Stretching it.
It's a long nursing. So anyway, so that's the approach that comes to Yom Kippur. So again, the approach to Yom Kippur is on one hand, you see it like an onion, where you pull away the fast, you're left with the Yom Tov, and the Yom Tov, you should treat it with all the accoutrements of a Yom Tov. Or are we dealing with a a situation closer to House of Cards, right? And you pull away the fast, and the way Termi uses is Meshave Lekechol, making like a weekday that doesn't have any concept of a commemorating of that particular day. Okay. Now, is this applicable? So that's generally, by the way, you may sometimes have a bencher that have texts that say, if you need to eat on Yom Kippur, say this and this. They actually have that in the text of certain benchers. However, does this same logical model apply to Tisha B'Av? Somebody needs to say to eat on Tisha B'Av. Do we assume that it's also like you peel away the fast, you're left with something else, or is it like this sort of multifaceted nature that if you need all the component parts, if you don't have the fast, then the whole thing falls apart? Okay, so the Gemara in Megillah has a very interesting anecdote. Gemara in Megillah's anecdote is that they had a practice of sending out messengers. Now, you're familiar with sending out messengers from the monthly Rosh Chodesh. They would declare when Rosh Chodesh was in the Beit HaMikdash. And then first they had the signal system that didn't work. So they would send out messengers to inform people of important times and dates. That's what they would do. Okay. So the Gemara says, you know what else they would inform people of? They would inform people of different months of the year when they're coming because they wanted to tell people of important dates of that month. So one of the months they would send people for is Av. Now, if you think about that, 1 second. Why? The only time you send people out is when you have a Beit HaMikdash where you're going to tell people what the new month is. Tisha Bav is a commemoration of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. How does that make sense? When they have the third Beit HaMikdash, we have the third Beit HaMikdash, are we going to commemorate Tisha Bav? That we have to send everybody for the month of Av? So the Gemara says, well, there is a very famous pasuk in the book of Zechariah, book of Zechariah. The pasuk says in Zechariah, that there will be a bunch of fast days that are going to be transformed into days of celebration. That's what the Gemara says. So the pasuk actually leaves out Tisha B'Av. The Tzom of Asar B'Tevet, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, they say those are all going to go away when we're going to be days of celebration. In fact, when we have the Beit HaMikdash. But Tisha B'Av, that looks like it's going to stay around. And so the Talmud says, why? Because Huchpalu Tzarot, that it was multiplied in the terrible things that happened on that day. Specifically, that he had 2 Beit HaMikdash that are destroyed on the day of Tisha B'Av. And then Talmud goes something even further. The Gemara and Megillah. That was Rosh Hashanah, this in Megillah. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi made an attempt to abolish Tisha B'Av. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the great sage, one of the greatest sages in Jewish history, Bikesh la'akor Tisha B'Av. Wanted to uproot Tisha B'Av. So, and they said Lahudu Chachamim, it didn't work. The rabbi says you can't cancel Tisha B'Av. So, what is the background to this? So the Mishnah Yavitz, Rabbi Tzal Zolti, very, very creative, great Talmud Chacham, suggests that actually the issue here between Rebbe and Chachamim about whether you should cancel Tisha B'Av or not is based on this question. which is Tisha B'Av has two components. One component is it's a day of fasting, like all the rest of the fast days. And one component is that it's a day of mourning. Avelu, right? If you look at all the other fast days, do we wear non-leather shoes? No, we wear whatever shoes we want. Do we sit on the floor on all the other fast days? No, we sit wherever we want. The only thing we don't do is eat or drink. But Tisha B'Av, we have this aspect of mourning. And so, says Rabbi, what Tisha B'Av is also an onion. Tisha B'Av is a fast day and a day of sadness, of mourning, of elegy. Which is why Rabbi said, maybe we'll pull the fast day away, and then we'll, don't have to, and that's what he explains it. He didn't mean he wanted to cancel Tisha B'Av. He said Tisha B'Av should be like the rest of the fast. And the rabbi said, no, because there was just so much tragedy on Tisha B'Av. It has to be a special kind of fast. But what Rabbi was saying is, it's a fast with a mourning day tacked on. So perhaps Rabbi would say, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would say, that if you need to eat on Tisha B'Av, you're pulling away the fast day and you're left with a day of mourning. And on a day of mourning, we say morning prayers, M-O-U-R-N-I-G. Right? We say morning prayers, including Nachim. So Rebbe's opinion would be that we should, if you need to eat on Tisha B'Av, you should make, obviously you don't have Kiddush, but you should make the, say the prayer of Nachem, say the prayer of consolation during the Birkat Hamazon, during your benching, like you would because you're just left with a fast day. I'm sorry, you take away the fast day, you're just left with a day of mourning, and this is an appropriate prayer to say on the day of mourning. Achamim, the second opinion would be the opposite, which is that it's all intertwined. It's not you mourn and you fast separately. You're fasting as part of your mourning. And if you pull away the fast, it's such an integral part, the whole thing falls apart. In which case, it would be, again, a delicious, no pun intended, irony to actually bench and say the words of, God, thank you for this food that you gave me on this Tisha B'Av day. Yeah.
When we mourn on a personal, when we lose someone we love and we have the day of the burial or we don't have to eat an egg.
Right.
We do eat. Like
exactly.
Eating is not part of mourning.
Well, I would say eating is part of mourning when you eat symbolic foods.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the laws of mourning is that when you come back from the cemetery, there is supposed to be a meal. Yeah. Yeah, no, and the meal is made up of an egg, but there's actually rules that you're not supposed to eat your own food. The community is supposed to bring you food. Exactly right. So mourning, right? Remember, that's the story of Jacob. He was making lentil soup. Yeah. He was making lentil soup, and the rabbis say that it was because it was the morning meal for his grandfather, Abraham, who had passed away.
I can understand why you can't eat meat, because that has to do with in the Beit HaMikdash we have sacrifices, so you can't have meat. But I don't really get and I can even understand the fast day because it just makes it even more difficult and painful. But I don't understand why, if Tisha B'Av is canceled or we get a third, it doesn't make sense to me that will stay.
So
I don't quite get that.
It may be a day of happiness, a day of remembrance.
Then you really should eat.
Yeah, no. We're not saying fasting. Tisha B'Av will be around as a day we commemorate, as opposed to the other fast days will be. It'll be what the commemoration will be. That's what we say, Kiru Alay Moed. Tisha B'Av has an aspect of a Moed, of a holiday, because we hope of the great rejoicing that will overshadow all the sorrow that's happened before. But the point that you make is a good one also in terms of the way in which, what is fasting because of? So the fasting and mourning are actually separate. And this is the point you made. Fasting, other than some people have the minute to fast on the Yortzeit, fasting is actually not a component. Yeah, and then certain Lithuanian Jews, although at Jacob we have the opposite. We sponsor a Kiddush. We sponsor breakfast. The Hasidim always have what's called a tikkun. Yeah, that they would dafka eat And you make a bracha in memory of the person on the yahrzeit. So the idea here is that fasting is separate from mourning. Mourning is about being sad and remembering what was lost. Fasting is a form of prayer. Think about when Esther fasted. Right? We fast in commemoration of Ta'anit Esther. In the story of Purim, what did she do? When did she call a fast? When she wanted the Jews to pray for salvation. And the Gemara, the Mishnayot in Moed Katan and in Megillah and Ta'anit all deal with the fact that fasting was a component of more intense prayer. They would talk about how you would have fast days to pray during the time when there was no rain. And if you didn't get rain for such and such a day, so you did an even more intense fasting. And if it didn't rain for such and such a time, you went even more. You always put. They would have Ne'ilah. They would have all these things. Ne'ilah wasn't just Yom Kippur; it was also in these communal fasts that happened as part of prayer. So again, the fast gets pulled away. That's that tefillah aspect, and then you would be left with the mourning aspect of Tisha Bav. Now, there is a very, very interesting addendum to this story in a contemporary section, which was the rabbis, including Rav Goren, dealt with what happens in 1967, 1948, 1967, right, where the text of the prayer of Nachem says, God, please console us on the desolate, the destroyed, the embarrassed Jerusalem, which is now standing in shambles and in ruins. That's what the prayer is. Vayabaluha ligionot, right? That it's been totally overrun. So the issue that was raised in those years was, should we stop saying that prayer altogether? It's not true. Jerusalem isn't in shambles. We have sovereignty. We have the access to the Kotel HaMa'aravi. We do have the ability to access it in ways, and maybe we should abolish this prayer altogether. This was a massive, massive debate. The organs of the chief rabbin in Israel were the the main interlocutors about this issue, and it became an issue of great, strife, because you would have certain people who would absolutely say you don't, for no other reason than davening is sacrosanct. We're not supposed to touch the davening and change it and cut and paste and say this doesn't apply, this does apply. Not supposed to do that anymore. So that was a very vehement opposition. But then you had political opposition as well, saying, are you sure it's as good as you think it is? Maybe we shouldn't, da, 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 da. So there was a time period where there were those who were contemplating and in fact either modifying or deleting this prayer altogether. Practically, those who said that you should potentially get rid of this prayer because Yerushalayim is in our hands and we have the ability to come as we please, etc. After they saw how the political control of Yerushalayim unfolded and the unrest and the things that are still missing, even they themselves retracted and said, leave it as is. When we have the third Beit HaMikdash and we have the true Geulah, that's when we'll get rid of it. So that was just an interesting aspect of what would be the time in which you don't say that. Now, what's interesting is that it's not 100% clear that our whole parallel holds. That what you learn on Yom Kippur is transferable to the discussion about Tisha Bav, because Yom Kippur, Ya'alev Yavo, is part of the order of the day of the Yom Tov, and the actual reason why you say Ya'alev Yavo is because you bring a special sacrifice that day, a korban, and that korban, is what. And the only reason to say to have the meal is because it's now Yom Tov and you aren't fasting, so you have a full meal. Like you said, you have challah, you have kiddush, you would have all that stuff. In which case, that may say, okay, you're having a meal because it's a Yom Tov meal. On Tisha B'Av, you need to eat, but Tisha B'Av isn't having you eat. right? It's saying you need to eat because you're not healthy and you need to make sure your body is safe, etc. So it could be that the parallel doesn't hold. It's not necessarily applicable. On a practical bottom line level, generally, we don't have people say Nachem in Birkat Hamazon. If they bench, and they don't say a special prayer. But on Yom Kippur, we do appear to follow the Torah, although there's an argument, Torah and Shibboleth Eleket, that if you do need to eat, and you need to eat not the way your dad ate, but a full meal, and you eat bread, you would actually say Ya'alev Yevo. You would actually say Ya'alev Yevo, which is why some of those benchers actually have it in it, which I thought was just a really just a fascinating thing. There are other aspects of what happens if you don't fast on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av. Very, very unique halacha. If you don't fast on Tisha B'Av, then there is a rule that the afternoon Torah reading is specifically connected to the Torah reading of the fasting. So there's a practice that if you're not fasting on Tisha B'Av, then you wouldn't necessarily get an aliyah during the fast day Torah reading. That's a practice. Whether or not it's always kept is not 100% clear, and we never ask anybody anyway. And the other one possibility is that you wouldn't necessarily be the chazan, where the chazan adds a prayer about the fast day. If you're not fasting, you don't add that. But the notion of the fast being an inherent part of the day is a really interesting question. Now, there's another very big difference between Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, which is that Yom Kippur is explicit in the Torah. The Torah says, "Thou shalt not eat." You're not allowed to eat or drink on Tisha B'Av, not on Yom Kippur. There's no pasuk in the Torah that says you're not allowed to eat or drink on Tisha B'Av. That is rabbinic. It's not mentioned in the Torah. It couldn't be. So, right, the Chumash Shacham Shetorah don't say on the 9th of Av you're not allowed to eat. The rabbis instituted that once it became clear that this was a day we must commemorate because of all the terrible tragedies that happened on it. So there's two very practical implications. One is that we're a lot more lenient on Tisha B'Av than we would be on Yom Kippur about potentially eating. The second is, and by the way, the hierarchy goes the lowest and least serious fast, Tani Esther. Then you have Tzom Gedalia, Tisha Asar B'Tevet, and Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, those fast days there that have a little bit more strictness. And then Tisha B'Av, and then the most strict is Yom Kippur. But Tisha B'Av does get treated with more stringency because of the fact that it's a 25-hour fast, the fact that it is a more serious fast day. And Yom Kippur is get treated with the most stringency. On a practical level, however, anyone who is what's called a chole sheyesh bo sakana, anyone who is in a medical condition that leads to a concern for their health by fasting, automatically does not fast on Tisha B'Av. On Yom Kippur, they also don't fast, but it's more of a shayla, so to speak. On Tisha B'Av, there's no fasting for a person who's a chole sheyesh bo sakana. For pregnancy, it's a middle ground. Whereas pregnant women do not fast at all and don't even need to ask a shayla about fasting, and nursing, by the way, for all the other fast days. They generally do fast on Yom Kippur unless they're in a very acute state of either pre or postpartum. And on Tisha B'Av, the assumption is pregnancy is not an automatic exemption from fasting on Tisha B'Av, but it leads to the potential for an exemption of fasting on Tisha B'Av, depending on obviously the doctor and the rabbi and whomever need to assess the medical situation. So that's the uniqueness of Tisha B'Av, where it's in that it's not a Torah fast day like Yom Kippur, but it does have more serious fasting elements when it comes to the length of the fast and the leniencies that will. So pregnant women are not automatically exempted from Tisha B'Av, whereas they are exempted from all of the other fast days. This issue may also impact kind of what we're saying, which is when the rabbis made Tisha B'Av and they raised the bar of the fasting, maybe the fasting is much more sort of integral part of the nature of the day, in which case that would lead one to say that if you aren't fasting because of your health condition, then you would not say a special thing about Nachem, because it's like the Shmuel said, it's mashve like a whole. It's like it's a non-day from the standpoint of Tisha B'Av. One last point, which is that the prohibitions aren't necessarily connected to each other. So if somebody is ill and they need to eat, that doesn't mean that they would cancel any of the other restrictions. So just because you need to eat doesn't mean you wear leather shoes. You don't say, oh, I'm eating, so for me, Tisha B'Av is canceled, so I don't have to do any of the other stuff of Tisha B'Av.
The shoes are not such a joy.
Right, it's also
Aren't
true.
certain things really outdated?
So that's a really great question. That's a really great question of what's called batla ha-ta'am, batla takana, which means at what point do we look at what we appear to be the reason of a law and say this law isn't necessary anymore, so we're going to get rid of it? Like you said, there are certain things, leather shoes are, certain sneakers are much more comfortable. Should you basically, if you want to make yourself uncomfortable, not be allowed to wear sneakers? So there is one Rabbi Herschel Schechter who does say that if there's a particular shoe that isn't leather but is extraordinarily comfortable, you should abstain from wearing that shoe too.
I have a friend who won't sleep with a pillow.
Right.
Shabbat,
Yeah, because that's concept of the discomfort. Yeah. So, but that's generally not universally. I mean, come up with sneakers, you're fine. But your point of when can we say, okay, this law is outdated, we're not going to have it anymore? With the caveat is that's a very slippery slope, because who decides what is truly outdated and what is ripe for cancellation, and what that line is, where you say, well, one person's outdated is another person's relevant. It's that on the other way around. One person's relevant, that's outdated to somebody else. So it's not always. So there are rules. There are rules about when you can, what's called mevatel, to undo a rule or a practice or a takana. Depends on the strength of the rule, but it also depends on who enacted it. If you think about it from a court case standpoint, right? So the Supreme Court, they have the most power, and anything they say is binding on every lower court. If a lower court says something, the Supreme Court can't say, oh, I'm sorry, the lower court said it. No, they have the power to uproot it. But the lower court can't say, oh, the Supreme Court said that, but I think it's outdated. I can't do it anymore. Doesn't work that way. Once the Supreme Court law is on the books, you have to be at the level of the Supreme Court to undo it. So that's true in halacha as well. That we say, Ein bein din yicholim levatel bein din deino shel chavero elam gadol mina b'chachma b'minyan, which means that you cannot uproot a officially established law unless you are of the stature, you're of that, hierarchy level of the people who made the law. And so that's a very, sometimes frustrating, but very important safety mechanism that's put in, because otherwise it would be anarchy and everything would stop and go and change all the time. So that's a sort of a fail-safe valve in the Torah law, in order to keep some level of continuity, tradition, and integrity. So that's a very, very fascinating issue about when we have the ability to say, oh, no, that's outdated. We're not going to do that anymore. One of the last points is that what we hope is the case is that Tisha B'Av is able to be a day of happiness and rejoicing, because we hope to be able to be the end of the galut, the end of the exile, and hopefully be able to share in happy and simcha occasions together. So this Tisha B'Av is this coming Saturday night. And we hope that everyone has a meaningful experience on Tisha B'Av, and hopefully also the ability to have smachot and happy occasions together. All right, so on that hand, I have a Shabbat Shalom and a Tzom Kal. We are on again next week. So we're back next week, either in person here or on the computer. And we will hopefully, there was probably 2 different Thursdays later in the summer we'll take off, but otherwise looking forward to staying on track. All right, have a great day, everybody.
How do you get it on the computer?